My sister lived off my money for 9 years. I finally exposed her. I want you to picture something simple before I tell you the rest of this. A kitchen table with 2 coffee cups on it, one going cold because the person holding it hasn't taken a sip in 20 minutes. That was me 3 months ago, sitting across from my sister Renee, watching her smile at me the way she always did when she wanted something, and realizing for the first time in my life that I didn't know who she was at all. I'm Daniel. I'm 36 years old. For most of my adult life, I thought I had a normal, slightly complicated, but ultimately loving family. My mother passed when I was 28. My father is still alive, though his memory isn't what it used to be, and he lives in a small assisted facility 2 towns over from where I grew up. And I have one sister, Renee, 2 years older than me, the kind of person who could walk into any room and make people feel like the evening had just gotten more interesting. Growing up, Renee was the one everybody noticed. I was the one who did homework on time and never caused trouble, which sounds like a compliment, but in my family, it just meant I was forgettable. Renee got the school plays, the prom photos in the newspaper, the boyfriend everyone talked about. I got Daniel, such a good boy, said in the same breath as someone reaching for their car keys to leave. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it matters later. Because the way a family sees you when you're a kid is usually the way they expect you to behave for the rest of your life. And sometimes if you let them, that expectation becomes a leash. For 9 years I sent my sister money. It started small. She called me crying one night, said her landlord was going to evict her unless she came up with $800 in 2 days. I had it. I sent it. She paid me back the next month every dollar, with a long text about how embarrassed she was and how it would never happen again. I believed her because why wouldn't I? She was my sister. We'd shared a bedroom wall for 18 years. I knew the sound of her laugh through drywall. 6 months later it happened again. Then again. The amounts crept up. 800 became 1,500. 1,500 became 3,000 for a car repair. Then 4,500 for a medical thing she didn't want to talk about. The repayments slowed down, then stopped being full repayments, then stopped altogether, replaced by promises. I'll get you back next month, I swear. Things are just tight right now. I never asked for collateral. I never asked her to sign anything. She was my sister. You don't make your sister sign things. By the time I'm telling you about the kitchen table day, I had given Renee what I later calculated, with my hands actually shaking while I typed the numbers into a spreadsheet, to be just over $211,000 over 9 years. I want to say that number out loud again because even now it doesn't feel real to me. $211,000. That's a house in some parts of the country. That's a kid's entire college fund. That's the difference between retiring comfortably and working until I'm 70. And here's the part that I didn't know yet, sitting at that table with my cold coffee. Renee didn't need any of it. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start at the kitchen table. It starts about 4 months before that, with a phone call from my father's assisted living facility that had nothing to do with money at all. The woman who called was named Pam, and she handled billing and finances for residents whose families helped manage their accounts. My father, since my mother died, had slowly handed over more and more of his paperwork to whichever of us had time, which mostly meant Renee, since she lived closer and I traveled for work. Pam called me because there was a discrepancy in a reimbursement form, something small, a few $100s that had been submitted twice. She wanted to confirm whether I had submitted a request, because the account showed 2 identical submissions a week apart, one approved and one denied for duplication. I told her I hadn't submitted anything. She said that was fine, it was probably an admin error, and she'd sort it out with Renee, since Renee was the one listed as the secondary contact on Dad's account. That should have been the end of it. Clerical thing. Nothing. But something nagged at me. Not suspicion exactly, more like an itch you don't notice until you've already started scratching it. I found myself a few nights later, sitting with a glass of water I wasn't drinking, looking through old bank statements on my laptop. Not because I thought anything was wrong. I told myself I was just being responsible, since I was the one who'd eventually have to help manage things if Dad's condition worsened. I want to be honest with you about something. I almost stopped right there. I almost closed the laptop and went to bed, because some small self-protective part of me already sensed that whatever I was about to find, I wasn't going to like it. There's a particular kind of fear that comes before you learn something you can't unlearn. I felt that fear that night and I ignored it because some other part of me, the part that had spent 9 years being the reliable one, the helpful one, the one who never asked questions, needed to know. The first thing I noticed was small. A transfer from my father's modest investment account, the one my mother had set up decades ago, and that none of us touched except for approved medical withdrawals, dated about 2 years back. For $1,000 withdrawn for home health equipment. I remembered that withdrawal. Renee had told me about it at the time, said Dad needed a stair lift installed at his old house before he moved into the facility. I remembered feeling glad someone was handling it, glad I didn't have to deal with contractors and invoices on top of everything else going on in my life that year. I went looking for the invoice. There wasn't one in the folder where Renee usually kept these things. I told myself that was normal. People misplace paperwork. Then I found a second withdrawal. 6 months after the first. Another $2,200, labeled medical transport. I didn't remember being told about that one at all. I sat there for a long time. The water glass sweated a ring onto the wood of my desk. I remember staring at that ring instead of the screen because looking at the ring felt safer than looking at what I was actually seeing. I'm not a detective. I'm an operations manager for a regional logistics company. My whole job is making sure numbers add up at the end of the day, making sure a shipment that left point A actually arrived at point B with everything it was supposed to have on it. I am, by training and by temperament, the kind of person who needs things to reconcile. So once I noticed the first crack, I couldn't stop pulling at it, the same way you can't stop touching a loose tooth with your tongue even though you know it's going to hurt. Over the next several weeks, in the evenings after work, after my wife Carla had gone to bed, I built a spreadsheet. I want to tell you about Carla for a second because she matters in this story more than I expected her to. Carla had never trusted Renee, not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet way a spouse sometimes sees what you can't see in your own family because they're not standing inside the blind spot with you. She never said anything against Renee in 9 years. Not once. She just used to get very still whenever Renee called asking for help, and I used to notice that stillness and not think much of it. The spreadsheet started with just Dad's accounts. Withdrawals, dates, listed purposes. Then I added a second tab, my own bank records, every transfer I had ever sent Renee, going back as far as my online banking history would let me pull, and then further back than that, into old email confirmations from money transfer apps I'd used in the early years before I switched banks. Took me 3 weekends to build. By the end, the picture wasn't blurry anymore. It was sharp enough to cut. Renee had been pulling small, irregular withdrawals from our father's accounts for at least 4 years, labeling them with vague medical or home care purposes that, when I actually called the facility and the listed vendors, did not exist. Pam, when I called her again, this time with specific dates, went quiet on the phone in a way that told me everything before she said a word. She said she'd need to escalate it internally and pull the original authorization signatures. And running parallel to that for 9 years was my own money. The transfers I sent Renee. When I lined the dates up next to each other, side by side in 2 columns on my screen, something became impossible to ignore. The timing. Almost every time Renee called me in crisis, desperate, embarrassed, swearing she'd never ask again, it was within 2 to 3 weeks of one of these withdrawals from Dad's account. Not after. Before. As though the withdrawals from Dad weren't covering some other expense at all. As though they were seed money, small amounts she pulled first to make something look legitimate, before she came to me for the larger amount to actually live on. I sat back from my laptop that night and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of cold I'd never experienced before, even in actual cold weather. It wasn't anger yet. Anger came later. It was something more like grief, the specific grief of realizing that a person you loved had been performing a role for you for nearly a decade, and you had applauded every single show. I didn't confront her right away. I want you to understand why. Because I think people sometimes hear stories like this and wonder why the protagonist didn't just blow up immediately. The truth is, when you find out something like this about someone you've loved your whole life, your first instinct isn't rage. It's disbelief. You go looking for the explanation that lets you keep believing in the person you thought you knew. I spent almost 2 weeks doing exactly that. Building theories. Maybe Renee had her own debt she was hiding and the money from Dad's account went somewhere legitimate I just didn't understand yet. Maybe there was an ex-boyfriend with a gambling problem. Maybe she was being blackmailed. I invented every story except the simplest one, because the simplest one was the one that hurt the most. It was Carla, finally, who said the thing I needed to hear. We were in the car driving back from visiting my father, and I'd been quiet for most of the ride. She finally said without looking at me, "You're trying to find a version of this where she's not the villain. I understand why. But you already have the spreadsheet, Daniel. You don't need another theory. You need to talk to a lawyer." I called my father's estate attorney the next morning. His name was Walter Greer, an older man who had handled my parents' wills for over 20 years and who had, I would learn, a quiet, patient way of letting people arrive at their own conclusions instead of pushing them there. I brought him the spreadsheet. I brought him 3 years of bank statements, the email records, the call I'd had with Pam, and a folder of screenshots from old text conversations with Renee where she described expenses that, according to the dates and the vendors, simply did not match anything real. Walter read through everything in near silence for almost 40 minutes while I sat in his office trying not to look at the framed photo on his desk of his own family, smiling, normal, uncomplicated in a way mine apparently never had been. When he finally looked up, he said something I still think about. He said, "I've seen 100 versions of this exact pattern, Daniel. The thing that always surprises people isn't that it happened. It's how long it took them to look." He explained that what I was describing, the unauthorized withdrawals from my father's accounts, was likely financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which in our state carried serious legal weight, separate entirely from whatever personal arrangement I'd had with Renee around my own money. He said the facility would have its own duty to investigate once Pam escalated things internally, and that depending on what they found, it could become a matter for adult protective services, possibly law enforcement. But he also said something that surprised me. He told me that exposing Renee publicly, dramatically, in front of the whole family at some holiday dinner the way I'd half fantasized about in my angrier moments, would almost certainly backfire. It would let her control the narrative, turn it into an emotional spectacle where she could cry and deflect, and make herself the misunderstood one. He said the only way to actually win this, to get my father's money back, to get any of my own money back, and to make sure Renee couldn't quietly keep doing this for another 9 years, was to be patient, methodical, and quiet right up until the moment I wasn't. I liked that. Quiet right up until the moment I wasn't. It became something I held on to over the next several weeks, a kind of private mantra. So we built the case. Walter helped me request formal account records directly from the bank for my father's accounts, which, because Walter held power of attorney designation alongside Renee, he was legally entitled to pull. What came back was worse than what I'd found on my own. Renee hadn't just taken small amounts here and there for 9 years. There was a pattern stretching back even further than I'd realized, almost 6 years before the first stairlift withdrawal I'd originally noticed, going back to right around the time our mother passed away, when grief had made all of us, especially Dad, less careful about paperwork than we should have been. There was also something else. A separate account. Dad had a small certificate of deposit, an old one, something my mother had set up decades earlier that none of us, including me, even knew still existed because it had been opened under her maiden name combined with his, some old joint account quirk from the 80s that nobody had bothered closing. Renee had found it. I don't know how, maybe going through old paperwork at Dad's house while helping him downsize. But she'd found it, and 3 years earlier, she had forged Dad's signature on a withdrawal request to drain almost 60% of it. I want to pause here because this is the moment, reading the actual document Walter put in front of me, the actual signature comparison, my father's real shaky elderly signature next to the smoother, more confident forgery, side by side on a single sheet of paper. This is the moment the grief turned all the way into something else. Something colder and more useful. Because a forged signature isn't a gray area. A forged signature isn't she was going through a hard time. Or, she didn't mean for it to go this far. A forged signature is a decision. It is someone sitting down on purpose and choosing to become a person who steals from her own father. There was a particular night, somewhere in the middle of all that record gathering, when I drove past Renee's apartment building without planning to. I wasn't following her. I just happened to be coming back from a client meeting nearby, and I slowed down without meaning to, the way you slow down passing a house that used to be familiar and now feels like it belongs to a stranger. I saw her car in the lot, a newer model than the one I remembered, the kind of car that didn't match anything she'd ever told me about her finances. I sat there for almost 10 minutes with the engine running, just looking at that car, doing the math in my head, wondering how many of my transfers, how many of my father's medical equipment withdrawals, had gone into those monthly payments. I didn't confront her that night either. I just drove home and didn't tell Carla where I'd been. because even I wasn't sure yet how to explain it to myself. I didn't tell Renee any of this yet. That's important. For another 6 weeks, I kept acting completely normal. I went to her birthday dinner. I let her hug me at the door the way she always did, this big theatrical hug that used to make me feel loved, and now made my skin crawl in a way I had to actively hide. I asked about her job, her apartment, her new boyfriend, a guy named Trent who worked in something vaguely described as consulting, and who always seemed to be between opportunities. I sat across from her at that birthday dinner, watching her laugh at something our cousin said, and I thought about the 2 signatures on that page in Walter's office, and I smiled and passed the bread basket. I'm not proud of how good I turned out to be at that. But I think it's also the part of this story that taught me the most about myself. I'd spent my whole life being the quiet, reliable one, the one who didn't make waves, and I had always thought of that as a kind of weakness, a kind of invisibility. It turned out that exact quality, the ability to sit still, to watch, to wait, was the only reason I was ever able to build a case strong enough to actually matter. The investigation at the facility moved slower than I expected. Adult Protective Services got involved after Pam's escalation, and there was a period of almost 2 months where I genuinely didn't know what was happening, because Walter advised me not to contact anyone directly and risk tipping Renee off before the records were fully secured. Those 2 months were some of the hardest of my life. I went to work. I came home. I helped Carla with our son's homework. I visited my father every Sunday, sitting with him in the little common room with the 2 bright fluorescent lights, watching him slowly lose track of which day it was, and every single time, I had to fight the urge to ask him directly if he remembered signing anything, knowing that even if he had once known the truth, that truth was slipping out of his reach a little more every week. There was one Sunday near the end of those 2 months that I think about often. My father, in one of his clearer moments, looked at me and said, completely out of nowhere, "Renee always did handle the money better than you. You worry too much, Danny." And I just nodded and said, "Yeah, Dad. She's good at that." And then I went home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, because that sentence, said with such simple, trusting affection, was one of the cruelest things I'd ever heard, even though my father meant it with nothing but love. Walter finally called me on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. The investigation had confirmed everything. The forged signature, the pattern of withdrawals mislabeled as medical and home care expenses, going back nearly 9 years. The facility had also flagged something I hadn't even known to look for. Renee had, for the past 2 years, been quietly adjusting the listed monthly income on my father's facility care agreement, understating it on renewal paperwork in a way that had qualified him for a reduced-rate assistance program meant for residents with limited means, despite the fact that his accounts, before she drained them, would not have qualified him for that program at all. She had been defrauding the facility's assistance program on top of everything else, essentially making the facility subsidize the very money she was stealing. Walter told me the facility's legal team and Adult Protective Services were prepared to move forward with formal findings, and that I had a choice to make about how I wanted to handle the personal side, meaning the $211,000 Renee owed me directly, money that existed in a separate, murkier legal space since I had given it to her voluntarily, with no written agreement, over 9 years of what looked, on paper, like nothing more than generous sibling gifts. This is the part where, in a lot of stories like this, you'd expect some explosive scene. Plates thrown. Shouting across a dinner table. Police showing up at a family gathering while everyone gasps. That's not what happened. I didn't want that, and more importantly, Walter was right that it wouldn't have worked. What I wanted more than anything was for Renee to understand clearly, privately, without an audience to perform for, exactly how much I knew and exactly how completely the story she'd been telling herself, the story where she was clever and I was just generous and naive, was over. So I invited her to my house. Just the 2 of us. I told her I wanted to talk about Dad's care plan going forward, since the facility had mentioned some changes were coming. That part wasn't even a lie. She showed up looking exactly like she always did, effortlessly put together in a way that used to make me feel proud to call her my sister, and now just looked to me like a costume. We sat at my kitchen table. Carla had taken our son to her mother's for the afternoon at my request, because I didn't want any witnesses to this either, not because I had anything to hide, but because I wanted Renee to have nowhere to perform to. I let her talk first. She talked about Trent, about a trip they were planning, about how exhausting her job had been lately. I nodded along, made the right sounds in the right places, and watched her the way you watch a magic trick once you already know how it's done, noticing every small move that used to fool you. Then I put a single folder on the table between us. I didn't open it right away. I just let it sit there while I said very calmly, Pam called me a few months ago about a duplicate reimbursement on Dad's account. Renee's expression didn't change much. A small flicker, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it. She said something about how billing at that place was always a mess, how she'd had to call them about errors a dozen times herself. I opened the folder. I laid out the first page, the spreadsheet, dates on one side, my transfers on the other, the pattern lined up so clearly that you didn't need any explanation to see it. Then the second page, the bank records from Dad's account, withdrawals labeled for medical equipment and transport services that, when called directly, had no record of ever serving my father. Then the third page, the one I'd been dreading and also, in some small, ugly way, looking forward to. The signature comparison. My father's real signature, shaky, familiar, beside the forged one. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that because I think the quiet of that moment was the most powerful thing in it. I said, I know about all of it, Renee. The withdrawals. The forged signature on the CD. The income misreporting on Dad's facility paperwork. I know you used small amounts from his accounts to set up cover stories before you came to me for the real money. I know exactly how this worked every step for 9 years. She didn't cry the way I expected. She didn't yell either. For a long moment, she just looked at the papers, and I watched something happen on her face that I'd never seen before in 36 years of being her brother. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to calculation, like she was running through possible responses the way you'd scroll through options on a screen, looking for the one that might still work. She tried a few. She said I didn't understand the full picture, that there were expenses I didn't know about, things she'd covered for Dad that weren't reflected anywhere because she paid cash. I let her finish. Then I told her, still calmly, that Adult Protective Services and the facility's legal department already had everything, that this wasn't a conversation where my believing her or not believing her actually changed anything anymore, because the investigation was already complete. That's when she stopped performing. I watched it happen in real time, like watching a building lose its scaffolding. She put her face in her hands and said, in a voice much smaller than I'd ever heard from her, I didn't think it would go on this long. I asked her what she meant. She said, almost like she was talking to herself more than to me, that the first time with the landlord had been real. She really had been about to be evicted. But somewhere in the months after that, she said she'd realized how easy it was. How I never asked questions. How Dad never noticed small withdrawals. How everyone in the family had always assumed she was the capable one, the one who had things handled, so nobody ever checked behind her. She told me about Trent, finally the real version. He wasn't between consulting jobs. He'd been unemployed by her account for most of the 4 years they'd been together, and a significant portion of both my money and my father's money had gone into supporting an apartment, a lifestyle, vacations posted on social media that I remembered seeing and feeling happy for her about, never once imagining where the money for any of it had actually come from. I sat there listening to all of it, and the strange thing was, by that point, the anger I'd been carrying for months had already mostly burned itself out, replaced by something quieter and somehow heavier. Not forgiveness. I want to be honest about that because I think it's tempting in stories like this to wrap everything up with some neat redemptive bow, and that's not what this was. It was something more like recognition. I finally understood my sister completely for the first time in my life, and the person I understood was someone I didn't actually know at all. I told her what was going to happen next. The facility's findings would go to Adult Protective Services formally, which she likely already knew was already in motion. Separately, Walter and I had discussed, and I had decided to pursue a civil claim against her for the $211,000, not out of cruelty but because Carla and I had a son, and that money represented things like his education, like our own ability to retire without depending on anyone else the way my father now depended on people who had, it turned out, not always deserved that dependence. I also told her something I debated saying for weeks, something Walter had actually advised against because he worried it gave her too much warning, but I said it anyway because I wanted her to hear it from me rather than from a letter. I told her that I would not be pursuing criminal charges on the personal money, the 9 years of transfers, because that was, legally and emotionally, a more complicated category, gifts without paperwork, and pursuing it criminally would mean dragging our entire family through years of proceedings that would hurt my father more than it would ever help me. But I told her plainly that the forged signature and the facility fraud were not mine to forgive or withhold. Those belonged to the people she'd actually stolen from, our father and the assistance program meant for residents who genuinely couldn't afford care. And that process was already moving forward with or without my input. She asked me very quietly if I hated her. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know yet. That hate felt like too simple a word for what I was feeling, and that I thought it might take me years to actually understand what I felt, but that whatever it eventually settled into, it wasn't going to involve giving her any more money, any more trust, or any more access to our father's finances ever again. The aftermath unfolded slower than any movie would have you believe. The facility's findings, combined with the forged signature evidence Walter had secured, led to a formal investigation by Adult Protective Services that took the better part of 4 months. Renee was ultimately required to make restitution to my father's estate for the forged withdrawal, and the facility, once the income misreporting was confirmed, adjusted his care agreement and pursued recovery of the wrongly subsidized portion, which Renee was also legally responsible for repaying. She lost her job during this period too, not directly because of the investigation, but because the stress of it, combined with everything else unraveling, made her unreliable in ways her employer eventually noticed and didn't tolerate. Trent left not long after that. I won't pretend I felt sympathy about that part. The civil claim Walter and I filed for my own money took even longer, nearly a year in total, winding through mediation before it ever got close to an actual courtroom. Renee didn't have anything close to $211,000 to give back, not in cash, not in assets. What we ultimately settled on through mediation was a structured repayment plan tied to wage garnishment once she found new employment, plus a portion of what she received once a small inheritance from our mother's extended family, an aunt none of us had been particularly close to, finally cleared probate. It wasn't the full amount. I want to be honest about that too. As of the day I'm telling you this, I've recovered a little under $60,000 of the $211,000, with the rest scheduled across a payment plan that, realistically, given everything I now know about how Renee operates, I expect to spend years chasing in pieces. But the money in the end wasn't actually the part that mattered most to me. What mattered was something Walter said to me on the day we filed the original complaint with Adult Protective Services, back before any of the rest of it had played out. He said that in cases like this, the families who heal fastest aren't the ones who get every dollar back. They're the ones who finally stop lying to themselves about what actually happened. I think about that a lot now, sitting at that same kitchen table where I once watched my sister's face crumble for the first time in my life. My father still doesn't fully understand what happened. We made the decision, Walter and I and eventually Carla too, not to explain the forged signature to him in detail, partly because his memory wouldn't reliably hold on to something that complicated and partly because I genuinely didn't see what good it would do him at this stage of his life, to know that one of his own children had stolen from him while smiling at his birthday parties. He knows that Renee and I had a falling out about money. That's the version he carries, and some days I think that's a mercy, and other days I think it's its own small private grief I carry alone, knowing the full truth while he gets to keep a gentler, incomplete one. Renee and I are not estranged, not in the dramatic sense people sometimes imagine. We don't speak often. When we do, it's brief, logistical, usually about Dad's care schedule or some piece of paperwork that requires both our signatures. There's no shouting anymore, no performance, no birthday dinners where I have to pass the breadbasket and smile through what I know. There's just a kind of careful, permanent distance, the sort that exists between two people who used to share a bedroom wall and now share almost nothing except a shrinking, complicated obligation to the same aging man. What I learned more than anything is that being the quiet one in a family isn't always a weakness, even when it feels that way for 30-some years. Sometimes the person nobody thinks is paying attention is the only one who ends up actually looking. Sometimes the most useful thing you can be, in the moment that finally matters, is exactly the person everyone always underestimated. I think about that night with the water glass sweating a ring onto my desk more than I think about almost anything else from this whole ordeal. The version of me who almost closed the laptop. The version of me who almost let the itch go unscratched, who almost let 9 years become 10, then 15, then however many more it would have taken before there was nothing left of my father's accounts at all, before there was nothing left of my own savings, before there was nothing left of whatever I'd once believed about my sister. I didn't close the laptop that night. And I think in the end that single decision to keep looking even when some part of me already sensed I wouldn't like what I'd find, is the whole story. Everything else, the spreadsheet, the lawyer, the kitchen table confrontation, the slow unwinding of 9 years of careful lies, all of it grew out of that one small refusal to look away. If there's anything I'd want someone listening to this to take with them, it's that quiet doesn't mean passive, and